gotta make sure that it will share. Thank you everyone for coming tonight. I think notwithstanding any further technical challenges, we'll get going now. A couple real minor housekeeping items. If you haven't already, please do sign in so we can track how many people are coming. Please take all the beverages and the snacks at the back of the room. Washrooms right around the corner, also at the back of the rec center there. A couple exits on my left here and on my right if they're needed, which hopefully not. So before we get going, we just want to do a simple general land acknowledgement. So we do want to acknowledge and honor the 4 nations whose traditional land we gather, the Sinixt, the Ktunaxa, the Secwepemc, and the Syilx. Obviously, a simple land acknowledgement is by no means any real answer to truth and reconciliation, but it is an important starting point. So we are happy to do that, and we do want to acknowledge the lands that we do gather on and we live, play, and we're very fortunate in this community of Revelstoke. So, thank you very much for attending tonight. The numbers are bigger than what we were anticipating. It is almost filled up. A little bit of room on the right side. I guess people like the left side a little bit better. That's okay. My name is Paul. I'm the Director of Development Services for the City of Revelstoke. With me today, I have Mr. Kenny Gyps, who is our Manager of Development Services, Shannon, who is one of our planning technicians. At the front, we have Jen and Phaedra, who are our Development Services clerks. We have Steve Black there, who's our Director of Engineering and Public Works, Francesca, who is our Communications Coordinator, and our CAO, Evan Parliament there. And last but certainly not least, we wouldn't be able to do any of this without our amazing IT staff behind the scenes in the curtain there. We have Jay from our IT group, who is an absolutely phenomenal asset, who gets all of this going, even with 2 power outages right now. So bear with us if there are any other issues, and we'll get through it. So tonight, we're here to talk about the zoning bylaw comprehensive rewrite. The event is being live streamed. You'll see at the back of the room, we have a couple big QR codes for the Slido app, and we also have a microphone here. So you're not gonna have to hear us talk very much. We're gonna give you guys a brief presentation, but the intent of this meeting is to answer any questions that the community has in advance of this big bylaw that we've been working on now since February 2023. Going to council for formal consideration, which we're anticipating early in the new year. So the key is to answer any questions you guys have right now today. So, high-level overview of the presentation that we'll give you. Shannon's gonna go over a little bit of the background of what a zoning bylaw is and why it's really important for people to understand what it means for their property, their neighborhood, and the community in general. We're gonna give you a high-level overview of how we ultimately got here. It's been a long process going on since February 2023 now, a lot of opportunities for community engagement, a lot of feedback that's been incorporated into this final version of the draft zoning bylaw. Kenny is going to go over some of the key changes introduced through this new zoning bylaw, and then hopefully we'll have about an hour, hour 15, hour 20 for Q&A. So please do be prepared with questions. You can ask them on the Slido app and then vote for which ones you think are best to go to the top. Or if you're a little bit more old-fashioned and you want to come to the mic, you are more than welcome to come up to the mic as well. So with that, one thing we do just want to go over, we like doing this at all the engagement events, rules of engagement. So everyone here is a member of the community. Everyone wants to see this community do really well. We have to be respectful of everyone. Understand that people have different perspectives, and part of the challenges we have at the city is trying to reconcile all those perspectives and incorporate them into bylaws. Oh, that's okay. So we want to focus on the future, not the past. So if you guys have complaints about the past and things that have been done, that's not what we're here for tonight. We're here to focus on the future going forward. Be mindful of time. Everyone came here tonight, took time out of their busy schedules. We want everyone to be able to participate, so no one cannibalize any time, myself included. And we want to stay on task. We're here to talk about the zoning bylaw. I know everyone wants to talk about some potholes that are on the road. Mr. Black will be more than happy to go and schedule a one-on-one meeting with you to discuss those particular with you. Be open-minded, listen to others' perspectives and learn. And then lastly, at the question period, please either do use the mic or again, speak clearly into the mic and use the Slido app. So with that, I will pass it over to Shannon, who is going to go over the amazing, exhilarating topic of what a zoning bylaw is.
Okay. All right, so a zoning bylaw is a regulatory tool used by municipal governments to regulate what can and cannot be built within the city. So one of the main things the zoning bylaw does is it governs the types of uses that are permitted on certain properties in different areas of the city, but it also includes regulations for things such as how dense a development can be, the size and shape of lots created through subdivision, the size, height, and placement of buildings on a property, and the types of residential tenure that's also permitted. So in BC, municipalities can create zoning bylaws because they are given the power to do so through the Local Government Act. So this allows local governments to control how land is used, manage growth, and make sure that development fits within the community's goals that's outlined in the official community plan. So why is this important and how does it impact you? So zoning works by dividing areas of the city into what we refer to as zones. So each zone permits different types of land uses and outlines development regulations that regulate density, size, height, and placement of developments on a property. So every property in the city has a legal zoning designation, and this determines how the property can be used and what can be built there. So for example, your zoning will tell you whether you can build a residential development, a commercial development, how many units can be on the site, and how big it can be. Paul often refers to this in simplest terms as what you can build on your property and how much you can build. So knowing a property zoning is very important to understanding what is allowed on the property and the type of buildings that can be constructed there. So zoning is actually informed by our official community plan, and the official community plan is a high-level policy document that provides a long-term vision for the community, and it sets out a framework for how the city will grow and develop over time. So through the OCP, we assign land use designations, which identify the desired future land use for all properties in the city, and it also outlines objectives and policies to guide development in a way that reflects community values and needs that are identified through the community consultation process. So while the OCP provides a framework for growth in the city, the zoning bylaw will regulate how specific areas of land can be used and ensures that the development aligns with the vision of the official community plan. So when the city receives applications to amend the zoning bylaw, one of the first things we will do is refer back to the OCP to see how the proposal aligns with the OCP, and that it plays an important role in whether staff take it to council with their support or not. So this is an image of two maps. So on the left, you have the official community plan land use designations, and this was created back in 2022 when we completed the project. And it is reflective of the feedback that we received from the community during the consultation process and how the community wants to see the city develop and where we should be concentrating, like commercial developments, residential, institutional, environmental protection. On the right, you have our existing zoning bylaw, which was created back in the 1980s. And one of the main goals we have for this project is to bring our zoning map to better align with the land use designations in the official community plan, so that your zoning is also reflective of what the community wants. So a bit about the project before we get into the specifics. I'm going to go over a quick high-level timeline. So we began the project back in February and May of 2023, and this is when we introduced the project. We had those initial discussions with council and sent out a community survey and had another public information meeting. So from there, we had more targeted stakeholder engagement, where we consulted with the building community, Chamber of Commerce, our Advisory Planning Commission, nonprofits, and local subject matter experts, where we discussed their concerns with the current bylaw and their expectations for the project. From there, we began drafting the new zones and the zoning map, and those were released between March and May of 2024. And with that, we also sent out a citywide mail out where we had 5,600 letters sent, where we sent people their proposed zoning and what this meant to them. We also held 14 coffee chat sessions where we met with members of the public and discussed their concerns with their zoning and any feedback that they had for the proposed bylaw. Between April and May of 2024, we reviewed the zones with council and also worked on incorporating the feedback that we heard during those coffee chats and any feedback we heard via email into the new draft bylaw and completed the full version. And that was released back in May of 2024. And then over the summer, we invited the public to review the bylaw and send in any feedback that they had. We also did some internal and external agency review, and we had a legal review, and also did some internal bylaw testing where we reviewed the bylaw against some of the applications we were receiving at that time. So between September and October of 2024, we did our final updates to the bylaw and then released our final draft version this November. And that brings us here. And from there, I'm going to pass it over to our Manager of Development Services, and Kenny's going to talk about some of the changes that were made.
All right, good evening, everybody. So some of the summary of the changes that we did, some of the key changes we did was one of the bigger pieces of it was the changes in density. With the density, we changed it to allow for a maximum of 4 dwelling units per lot spread across no more than 2 buildings. So that was the least impactful way we could do it, where we're still meeting the requirements of both the legislation as well as providing additional density allowances within the community, but have less of an impact overall on visually for some of these properties. Additionally, we changed how we calculate the density in the medium and high density zones based on floor area ratio rather than units per hectare, which incentivizes the creation of a larger quantity of smaller units rather than the smaller quantity of larger units. So again, trying to incentivize some of those smaller accessory dwelling units, things along those lines. One of the other changes was the mapping. So we did pre-zone 12 lots adjacent to Victoria Road to mixed use for consistent zoning. And so that just is consistent zoning along Victoria, just to, again, keep that consistency running throughout. Additionally, we pre-zoned 18 lots within central Revelstoke to allow for housing on lots suitable for residential. That's those small 25-foot lots that you're seeing in downtown. Then that way we can still allow a home on there without having to necessarily go through that variance process. Again, try to cut down on some of that bureaucracy piece of it. We changed some of the zoning for some of the properties along West Side Road and Highway 23 North, as well as the Big Eddy to environmental and rural recreation to protect some of the environmental features. So when you look at our map, our zoning map, you will start to see some of the properties around the outside of the city boundary, just kind of along that edge. We did change some of those ones to, again, protect some of those more environmental features. Additionally, we changed the uses permitted, all the uses permitted, reviewed, combined, removed, and added where needed. So we did go through, took a look at a lot of those uses, take a look at the definitions of them, and then update them to meet current needs. Along with, so that's one of the bigger changes we did as well. We also increased the permitted uses in all zones. We did this as well in our current bylaw. We did a recent amendment to our current zoning bylaw to allow daycares as a permitted use within, childcare facilities as a permitted use within all zones. We're carrying that over, and then allowing the use of community gardens, beekeeping, public art, EV charging, and solar regeneration. Then we did some of the updates to the development regulations. So we reduced the setbacks, increased lot coverage, and reduced minimum lot sizes in residential zones to promote the infill development. Again, trying to reduce some of the additional or the unneeded variances and reduce a piece of that, a little bit of that bureaucracy. We increased building heights in medium and high density zones to allow for 4-story buildings in medium density and 6 in high density. Just for clarity, there are no properties currently proposed to be zoned as a high density. We also included some greater flexibility regarding carports and greenhouses, and then residing in RVs during construction of a dwelling. Just for a little bit of clarity, that is not full-time occupation. That is intended only for a limited time during construction to help provide a little bit of an offset, again, recognizing there is a bit of a rental challenges here in town. We did update some of the landscaping provisions for multi-unit residential, commercial, and industrial. We updated the regulations for accessory buildings, accessory dwelling units, and clarification for shipping containers. I know everybody loves those. We updated the home-based business regulations as well. So that was one of the big pieces of feedback we did receive from a lot of the community during the summer feedback we received. And it was very predominantly around, or there's quite a bit of it around the need for greater flexibility when it comes to home-based businesses and allowing individuals to greater opportunity to start their business at home instead of having to hit that high upfront cost of getting a commercial property. And then the topic everybody loves, parking. So we did change some of the parking regulations. We're proposing 1.5 spaces required for all multi-unit dwellings. Clarified no visitor accessible parking for row home dwellings with individual driveways. No parking requirements for ADUs under 29 square meters. So that is the accessory dwelling units. That would be your smaller secondary suites or carriage houses or garden suites. New minimum bicycle parking requirements for new development. Again, recognizing we are an active community, bicycles are a big part of our community and active transportation, so we need a place to store all those bikes. Greater allowances for shared parking for commercial and industrial uses, and then updated parking bonusing regulations for developments within 300 meters of a bus stop and a grocery store. Again, we've done, thanks to Mr. Black's team as well, like we've done fantastic updates to a lot of the transit, and we really want to try to encourage people to start utilizing that. We also did some shared parking for restaurants and tourist accommodation in the downtown and fringe area, and removed the loading requirements for downtown and downtown fringe areas. So everybody's asking, what are the next steps? So obviously we're here today to talk about it a little bit more, and then we're anticipating early 2025 for the date of initial council consideration. After that initial consideration, a public hearing will then be scheduled. We will be putting that out on social media as well once we do get that date, and we'll make sure that it's in the newsletter. So shout out to everybody. Make sure you sign up for the city newsletter. You get some good information in there, and then you can keep apprised of all the information going around, as well as some good highlights on different things happening around the city. The council at that time may direct changes to the bylaw based on their review and public feedback received. So come out to the public hearing, share your thoughts. Council will love to hear it. And then if directed by council, staff will make the changes that they request prior to final council consideration. All right, so we're going to open it up to some questions now. Just as a reminder before we get into it, if you are going to have some questions, we do ask that you either do it through the Slido app or come up to the microphone and speak clearly. That way the people online can still hear what's being said. That was one of the biggest pieces of feedback we received last time as well, was people were struggling to hear questions that were spoken just in the room. So if you're not comfortable coming up to the mic, please just utilize one of the Slido app. It'll pop it up here on the screen for us. We also have it, you'll see Paul is looking at his phone. He's not just checking the hockey score. He is actually keeping an eye on the Slido app as well. So with that, I'll pass it back to Paul here, and we'll open it up for some questions.
There we go, that's a little bit better. I see we have 6 questions online right now. However, 5 of them are from the same person and they're very similar, and I want to give opportunity for people that have showed up in person today, if there's anyone with some immediate burning questions that is brave enough to be the first one to come up to the mic, and I see we have one, so good on ya.
I'm trying to, I don't know if this is on. Is this on? Okay. I'm wondering about the parking. Is this, you know, you speeded through that and I didn't quite understand. Is this a reduction in the requirement of parking? Is that, I'm wondering, where are people supposed to park? Because most people have cars. I know we'd like them to not drive in town, but is this a reduction in the required parking for everywhere?
So in general, it's very dependent on the use that you're undertaking and sometimes where that use is located within the city. So there are reductions in parking for some residential uses. So some examples are, right now, we require 2 vehicle spaces for every single row house, every single apartment building unit. We've changed that, or sorry, every single row house is 2 and an apartment is currently 1.5 spaces per unit. We've changed it to be 1.5 across the board, and that has to do with how we've reclassified the dwelling definition in the zoning bylaw. So we have 3 different types of dwellings: a single detached dwelling, 1 unit. We have a duplex, 2-unit dwelling, 2 units in there. Both of those still require 2 vehicles per unit. And then for a multi-unit dwelling, which would be anything with 3 units and more, triplex, 4plex, row houses, apartment building, you would need 1.5 parking spaces per unit. And I know parking is such a big thing in every community, and you know, I've been here for 5 years now, and before I moved out here, my old manager told me, "Oh, you're moving to a city?" I said, "Yep." I said, "Get ready, all you're gonna deal with is parking issues." It's such a North American-centric item that we all have a car, we all have multiple vehicles, and we can't think about a life without a vehicle, and I can totally appreciate that. It's two things that are, we all want affordable housing, right? Two things that do influence affordable housing is minimum parking requirements, as well as the length of time it takes for someone to get through an approval process. So on the former, we have to consider our minimum parking requirements very, very carefully to achieve other items that we're trying to achieve, such as housing affordability within the community. So there are some reductions in there. It's following the transportation master plan that's been adopted, following the provisions of our official community plan, trying to promote more public transit, alternative modes of transportation, like using your bike, and also trying to get people, if they are visiting the community, carpooling, taking shuttles to get out here, and when you get here, park your vehicle and take public transit. That's the ultimate goal that we're trying to get to here.
And it's a nice goal, and I appreciate that, but it's not working so far, and I don't see it working well in the future. Well, the local residents are gonna suffer before anything happens. I ride my bike a lot around town, but snow removal time, I don't know, have you talked to Public Works about how this works when we don't have parking on site and we're all parking in the street? That's a problem where I live.
Yep, so we work with the Public Works Group, we work with the engineering group. The city will be initiating a parking management strategy that will predominantly be focusing on downtown and the surrounding areas of downtown, and we'll be doing that in 2025. And with that strategy, we'll be examining metered parking, a permit parking system for locals within the residential areas. And just so you guys do know, Kenny also oversees our bylaw enforcement group. They literally follow the plows around with tow trucks behind them and tow people and ticket them if they are parked on the road. So we appreciate everyone's concerns from an operational perspective, but I think it's really important that we distinguish between that operational element that is manageable and the minimum parking requirement that we impose on new development, because we have to keep it in context of these broader goals that we're trying to see. We want to diversify our economy so that we're more sustainable in the future. We want to see housing be more affordable in this community. If we're doing nothing but building parking lots, and they will get full if you build it, it's that old adage, if you build it, they will come. Is that the future that we're trying to build here in Revelstoke, or are we trying to build something where, yes, there will be this transitionary period, but if we enforce our parking regulations really well, we make sure that locals are taken care of when we look at metered parking and allowances for them and permit parking systems, is that more the future we want to go? Not to mention, this completely ignores, all I hear in Revelstoke is this climate issue. People are very concerned about the climate issue. But then the big elephant in the room is we need to build huge parking lots to incentivize people to drive here via motor vehicle, which is the antithesis of trying to address the climate issue, right? So there's all these competing factors, and I'd really just encourage people to take kind of a broader view and be part of this parking management strategy we're going to be doing. It's going to quantify some of the challenges we have, where the pinch points are, but it's also going to give us real data on how real these issues are. I get it when you drive downtown and you can't see a parking spot right out front of the building you want to go to, it feels like there's no parking. But sometimes just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not there. There is a psychological element to it as well. So having to walk a few blocks is definitely not indicative of a parking challenge that we have right now, I would say, but definitely a balance that we're trying to strike with this bylaw. And we haven't gutted regulations. You look at other municipalities, Edmonton's a good example. They have snow management issues as well. They completely axed all their minimum parking requirements and said, let the market sort out how much parking there's going to be. We haven't come close to going that far. So I don't see any pitchforks here tonight, so that's really good. And I don't want people to think that we're just gutting regulations totally. So I encourage everyone, take a look at the bylaw, section 11. All the minimum parking is spelled out there for all development. And if there's something in there you don't like, come out to the public hearing, inform council, do some research with other municipalities and say, look, the city's too low on this. I think you should change it to X, Y, and Z. That's what we want to hear, right?
Okay, well, you'll get that in writing from me, and
Awesome.
my concern is not being able to drive downtown. My concern is a downtown resident. I have nowhere to park. So,
Thank you very much. That's very fair. Is there anyone else who would like to come up to the mic right? Oh, we got a second one. Awesome.
Just a couple of questions regarding to structures and density. It says here, 4 dwellings are permitted per lot and no more than 2 buildings. Can you have 4 units in one building?
Yes, you can.
Awesome. Could you have 4 units in one building and a garage?
Yes, you can, as long as you're following the accessory building regulations.
And then I know that part of this community, a significant portion of it with regards to how it functions and employment tourism with the mountain, rooms are rented on a pretty on a pretty frequent basis. So are there rules and regulations with regards to rooming houses?
Yes, there is. There is minimum parking requirements for, we've reclassified it to just be long-term rental rather than a boarding and rooming house. So, and we're gonna have to work on updates to our business license bylaw to make sure people are pulling licenses. But essentially, I think you can go up to, I have to double check the specific regulations in section 11, but there are minimum requirements. Once you get over a certain number of bedrooms that you're renting, then you would need 1 extra parking space for every additional 2 bedrooms that you're renting.
Okay. And that's, did you say that's section 11?
Section 11 of the bylaw, yes.
Right on. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'll give an opportunity for some of the, oh, come on up.
Thanks. My question is a little bit area specific, so it has to do with the West Side Road area where it appears you've made changes for environmental purposes there. So I currently occupy a piece of property at 64 West Side Road, which is right on the Big Eddy there. You're probably familiar with it, but it's an old
Sorry, could you just speak a
light
little bit
industrial area. I have a purchase, I don't own the property, so I don't have the paperwork that you mailed out, but I was shown the paperwork by the landowner. We have a purchase agreement, so we're in the process of purchasing it. I since returned that paperwork. I was hoping to have it here for you specifically, but the thing that I read in there that I was concerned about, it seemed to change the ability to have a caretaker suite on a lot from a 700 square foot caretaker suite down to a 120 square foot caretaker suite, I believe was the change that was printed, which kind of really isn't a caretaker suite. So I'm just wondering if you could clarify that, if that was, if I misread it, if I misunderstood it, or if that is the change and that's something that I need to comment on.
One thing, please don't write into council and ask us to change everything to Imperial. I get it, and especially those in the building community, you guys love Imperial. This is a mix-up with Imperial and metric. So the previous zoning bylaw capped it at 70 square meters, I believe, and we changed it to 120 square meters. So it's square meters, not square feet. So we've increased the allowance for the size of what we would refer to as an employee dwelling unit now.
Yeah.
So you can still build one, and it's actually bigger, the one you can build, than what the prior bylaw allowed for, so we expanded that allowance. But again, please, we really want this bylaw to be in metric. We're in Canada, it should be in metric, and I know people work in Imperial, I appreciate it.
Yeah, we all build it.
But it does convolute the bylaw when we include both metric and Imperial. So again, if you feel really strongly about that, we will accept that feedback, but metric is where we live.
Yeah, cool, perfect, thank you.
No problem. So I'll answer a few of the questions online. We got 10 questions online, so that's good. First question is, as an expanding resort town isolated from major public transit links, the need for downtown parking, particularly in established requirements for MU2 zone, which would be the current C2 zone, the downtown fringe zone. This will likely see future development, must be considered. Has it been considered? Yes, it has been considered. And one thing I just want to make clear about the downtown and the downtown fringe zone in particular. We did not change any of the development regulations or development rights within these zones, and we did not change any of the permitted uses that are allowed within these zones. The city will be planning, we're hoping in 2026 to do a downtown plan, and that downtown plan will require a lot of public feedback, a lot of public engagement. It's such a big process that that plan would inform future zoning bylaw changes if they're needed in the downtown and the downtown fringe area. So I just want to be really clear. We didn't change any of the development regulations or permitted uses within those areas. The parking regulations have shifted ever so slightly. The big ones that would impact the downtown and the downtown fringe area is removing the loading stall requirement and allowing for shared parking for uses of tourist accommodation where a restaurant is located within the tourist accommodation building. The next question online is with MU2 zone, the heritage alteration permit for the Copeland shows there is either lack of policy, conflicting guidelines, or unenforceable policy and guidelines for this, leaving our town open to being exploited with no regard for neighborhood integrity. That's not really a question, it's more of a comment, so I would definitely encourage people, I don't want to tell you not to put any comments out there, but we are here to answer questions on the zoning bylaw, and for that project in particular, just to kind of put this to bed, the zoning, the development regulations, and the uses that are allowed there have been in place since 1982. The only changes that have occurred since then is in 2013 when the use hostel was added in, which would have allowed a tourist accommodation building. And in 2022, we did a cleanup to the uses as part of our phase 1 of the zoning bylaw rewrite to consolidate hotels, motels, motor hotels, lodges, guest cabins, all under one use. So we had all these antiquated uses respecting different forms of tourist accommodation that were really clumpy and difficult to administer, and we merged it all into one. So there hasn't been any change in development regulations that would enable that project. The development regulations have been in place since 1982 that allow for the density and the building height that was proposed for that project. One of the questions on here, and I'll pass this one off to Kenny, is I've heard no more single family development. What does that mean?
So just to be clear, you are still allowed to build a single family. That development right has not changed. We have not taken away development rights within the zones to allow for single families. It was one of those things like in the RLD1, it's not changed. It's still there. We've just, I believe, Paul, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe we did change the terminology around it. However, it is still, a single family dwelling is still permitted within a majority of the zones. It's not something we're looking to change. All it did, we changed some of the language around, again, with some of the recent legislation to allow for those 4 dwelling units across 2 buildings, but single family dwellings are still permitted. That's not going to change.
One of the things we did change though is our current medium and high density zones, they allow for single family dwellings in there. We took that out. It waters down the integrity of the zones. When a developer comes in and says, I want to rezone to a medium density zone, I'm going to build an apartment building. A year later, they have all their permits, everything's lined up, and they say, actually, I'm going to build 2 monster single family homes. That's not in line with what council's intent was when they were approving the rezoning application. So we've crafted these zones to be more particular about the development form that it will enable so that there's greater certainty for the community. When the community sees a zoning bylaw amendment get adopted and a property zoning is changing, there should be some level of certainty as to what is going to be built on there. And cleaning up the bylaw in this way will do that for the community. Does anyone have any other questions that they want to come up to the mic, or should we keep going off of the Slido app? You don't have to be shy. You're allowed to come up to the mic. It's okay. We encourage the participation. Like I said, there's no pitchforks in here. We even have a council member who's coming up here.
Tim Palmer, City of Revelstoke Councillor. Just further to that last question, just for clarification, in the past for single family, we restricted certain areas to a single family, and that ability of the municipality to restrict to that use and only that use has been taken away by the province. Is that correct?
That is correct. And just to give a general overview, some of you may have heard of 2023 was an incredibly busy year for the NDP government in BC. They passed a lot of planning legislation, and they took away our ability to control zoning in a really particular manner. So they eliminated what we would call exclusionary zoning, where you are only allowed to build a single family dwelling within these parts. They said we have to accommodate a minimum of 4 units per lot, and we had to do that by June 30th, 2024. So the way the city tackled that was we accommodated 4 units per lot by the set deadline by the province. We did that in what would be the least invasive way, which means you can do a duplex with suites. Now with this bylaw rewrite, it's important for people to understand how we're carrying that forward. We're allowing 4 units per lot as proposed right now, but flexibility in how you do that. The only restriction is it can't be in more than 2 buildings. So you could have 2 duplexes on a property, You could have a triplex and a little garden suite. You could have a set of 4 row homes. And it's really important, when we were at the coffee chats back in April and May of this year, that was one of the key pieces that came up. And we need the community to show up to say, was that the right approach? Is that going to work for Revelstoke? Do we want that flexibility, or do we want to be more restrictive? So that's one of the key pieces. I really do encourage people to delve into a little bit further and show up for the public hearing if you don't think that that was the right way to go, or maybe there should be more flexibility. We need to hear that from the community. And what we heard when we did the coffee chats is that we kind of walked this middle of the road path that seemed to sit well with people. But again, council will want to hear from the community if that wasn't the right approach. That is a very good question. So the question was, why only 2 buildings when we're accommodating 4 units per lot? It becomes really challenging from a servicing and an access perspective if you go past 2 buildings on some of these smaller lots, where just imagine like a little cottage court, 4 single-family dwellings. And we also have some big lots in the city that are 1,000 square meters plus that could accommodate some very large houses on there. So imagine if you see 4 huge mansions kind of crammed onto a big lot in Arrow Heights that's totally out of line and out of character with the rest of the community and the rest of the neighborhood. So we're trying to control that development form in a way that it doesn't just become this free-for-all, but we're still trying to provide some flexibility so that individual landowners get an ability to utilize their lot to the maximum purpose while still respecting the character of the neighborhood. Does that make sense? Yeah, those cottage courts can be really difficult. A lot of panhandle access.
It was also one of the pieces of feedback during the coffee chats, as Paul was saying there. That was one of the pieces that we did talk quite a bit about. And that was one of the bigger feedbacks we received is we don't want to have properties that just have straight 4 single-family homes on it. We want it to be, that doesn't really fit the Revelstoke, vibe. And people wanted to kind of keep it and maintain it where it still maintains a little bit of the characteristic of Revelstoke.
So we'll go back to a couple of the questions online here. So how is redevelopment or new construction in the MU1 and MU2 zone? And keep in mind that's the downtown and then the downtown fringe area. How is it being considered when also overlapping the heritage conservation area? What is there in the bylaw rewrite that prioritizes heritage components, specifically character and scale? So again, I want to make clear, we're not changing any development rights, any development regulations, or any permitted uses within the downtown or downtown fringe area. Much bigger question that we need further community input. And there's already so much, as we kind of gave you a high level overview and you guys all have the fact sheet, delve into it. There's so much packed into this big bylaw rewrite that we've been doing for the last 2 years and so much feedback that's already been incorporated. There's 2 items that we didn't want to touch with this bylaw rewrite. The first one being the downtown and downtown fringe area. That's too big of a project to cram into this already massive project. And then the second is short-term rental. Both of those items are influenced by zoning, and those are such big topics for this community that they warrant their own separate projects so that this community can effectively participate in those particular items. So just want to be really clear with those items. Chance for anyone who's attending in person, if you want to come up to the mic. You got another brave soul up here.
Yeah, what the heck. So I live in Columbia Park, and so that's the new zone R1, so that's the new RDL1, whatever it's called.
RLD1.
RLD1. But, so can someone come in, knock their house down and build 2 duplexes on their property? And then the parking requirements, again, it gets back to parking. Do they have to have parking on their property for all those people that could be living, that could be 12, 14 people living on that property? And do they have, like I just see we already have parking issues, especially in the wintertime. And so where is this quadruple amount of parking going to come from? And saying that, oh, we don't want people to have cars when you live in Columbia Park just isn't really a viable thing.
Can I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
How many parking spaces do you think they should have per unit?
A minimum of 1 per unit.
Well, you're going to be very happy.
Okay.
It's a minimum of 2 per unit for a duplex right now
On their property.
on their property. So that's what we would classify. And the zoning bylaw doesn't regulate on-street parking. That's where our bylaw enforcement team, in conjunction with our operations group, would be dealing with, because on-street parking is public parking on city right-of-way. The zoning bylaw regulates minimum requirements for new development for off-street parking.
Okay.
And the only way you can get around that is if you apply for a variance, or in some cases, there's the ability to pay cash in lieu of providing the on-street parking. And one thing that our group gets, and again, 'cause I know the parking's gonna come up, our group has gotten a little bit of flack over the last couple of years for variances that have been supported in order to reduce parking. This bylaw is so critical because there's 2 pieces we need to sort out as a community. One is our minimum parking requirements in the zoning bylaw, and the other one is our cash in lieu program for when people are going to be paying cash in lieu. And if we get all this sorted by 2025 is the goal, you won't see support for variances because we don't have a parking bylaw that's based on 1984 regulations that things have changed over the last 40 years. We don't need this much parking. And, you know, there's even some questions about if 2 parking spaces per unit for a single family or a duplex is a bit overkill, right? So it's,
I struggle with the logistics of it, because you take a lot, a standard size lot, you're gonna put 2 duplexes on it and 8 parking spots. Is residential subject to the same green space requirements as the industrial and stuff like that?
really good question.
So I can't see how it's all gonna work, because there's just, we're just gonna end up with paved neighborhoods.
See, so one thing that this bylaw does really well, so you're gonna like this, and part of the bylaw, we're trying to do more with less, but we're also trying to retain the things that we all love about living within traditional residential neighborhoods. So yes, they need to provide the off-street parking. They can build up to 4 units per lot, but they have restrictions on what we call maximum lot coverage.
Right.
So how much of the lot you're able to take up with buildings. And one thing we've incorporated into this bylaw that we don't currently have is a maximum requirement in all zones for what we call impervious surface coverage.
Right.
So all your buildings plus all your pavement. And within a standard residential zone, the maximum lot coverage would be 50% for buildings, and I believe we're at 65% for impervious. So you have at least 35% of the lot that would be retained as green space or usable open space.
And so that all math has to line up when they apply for the permit, or it's just not gonna work.
This is fun for the builders and the designers in town. And we
Okay.
have a couple in here, and I won't
Okay.
single them out, but they're super creative.
Okay.
And this is where, too, again, we set the ground rules for what these numbers are to achieve what the
Right.
community wants to see. And then it's up to the designers to come in with something and the builders to build something that meets that requirement. You're gonna have the odd circumstances. Zoning bylaw is never a one-size-fits-all solution. The amount of variances we get that are from just local property owners looking to build a carport or a deck or maybe a little addition onto their house, that's what most variance applications we get are. They're not the big, huge-scale developments, right? So the designers, they have to build within the regulations of the bylaw. If there's good reason not to, they can apply for a variance. We're hoping with this bylaw rewrite that we're reducing the necessity for so many common variances.
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
Real quick, just to expand on that, one of the things we talked about at the coffee chats as well, for those of you that weren't there, zoning bylaws, it's that ground level, right? So zoning bylaw sits what the permitted uses are, and then it dictates all your setbacks, your density requirements. There are other requirements that are then on top of that, right? So just because the zoning bylaw allows for you to have those 4 dwelling units, you still have to prove out the feasibility that it'll actually work on that lot, right? So not only do you have that impermeable surface, your parking requirements, you have your building code requirements and your servicing requirements. So that's where, again, it's not that everybody can go and knock down their house right now and build 4 units. It may not be feasible to fit that on your property, but that's where, as Paul said, right? You talk to your contractors, you talk to your local designers, and they got to get a little creative to see how they can make it fit within those regulations.
And with that, one thing that did come up a lot in the coffee chats is this fear that entire blocks are going to be leveled to allow for 4 units per lot. If anyone in here has a house on a lot, are you going to sell it to a developer for just the price of the land? Of course not. So that developer needs to come in, buy your house, buy the value of the land, pay $50,000 to demolish the house, and then pay, which is usually $400 to $600 a square foot for construction in Revelstoke. That's very expensive. And the economics don't really work out that well. So there was a lot of concern that this is going to happen on every single lot in the city. there's no way it's going to happen on every single lot in the city. The pro formas for these projects just won't make sense from a development perspective. So that is something that's important to keep in mind. You will see some empty lots and some people that have had them for a while that will be developed with 4 units. But how realistic is it that it's going to happen on every single lot, right? So something that's really important to keep in mind as you're looking at the new zoning bylaw. One of the other questions we have online, will the current use descriptions be expanded upon if we use MU2 as an example, and again, consider the Copeland development? It is a hotel and restaurant, 4-bedroom B&B with dining room to a 23-bedroom plus 125 max restaurant is a significant change. So again, I won't belabor the point anymore. The development regulations within that zone are not changing as a result of this bylaw rewrite. Another question is parking is always an issue, so I think we've covered that one. Again, you guys will see opportunities for engagement as part of a parking management strategy that we're hoping to tackle in 2025. Please do be part of that. It will be a really interesting project that will help quantify some of the pinch points that we have and come up with some really cool creative solutions on how we're going to address parking in the long term. And one thing I do want to note, I understand that there is a perceived parking challenge and there might be times where those pinch points are there. We are very early on in this as a community. Revelstoke is still a bit in its infancy from a development perspective. So the fact that we're already getting on this now before we get to the point of other towns and we can learn from some of those mistakes, I see that as a really positive thing for this community that we're getting well ahead of this. I see we have another individual who is going to brave the microphone. Excellent.
Hi.
Hello.
I'm wondering, I mean, one of the goals we have is to provide a lot more long-term rental kind of things. And the majority of the built residents at this point are single-family dwellings. So what we see is the conversion of single-family dwellings to long-term rental. And I'm just interested in a couple of things. One is the whole issue of septic and those kinds of, if they're connected to the sewer system, that's one thing. But there are a great many residences that are on a septic. And the second thing is, as you put a lot more people into a single-family home, which is unregulated at the moment, what happens about the parking then?
More parking. Excellent. We love it. Now, it's super important. And again, the community has gone through so much change over the last decade in particular. So all very valid questions in terms of how it's impacting your neighborhood. So for septic, whenever we have new development, we always make sure that interior health approvals and that items are signed off by what we call a ROMP, a registered on-site wastewater practitioner. So there are those checks and balances from a technical perspective, but it is up to interior health they are the authority having jurisdiction for septic systems. And Mr. Black and his team, they have the very audacious goal of providing septic eventually, or sewer, sorry, eventually to the entire community. And there's been some really good work in the Arrow Heights area. So that is kind of the long-term vision for the city as well. And then what was the last part of the question? The parking for long-term rental. So we do have minimum parking requirements in the zoning bylaw for long-term rental. And one of the items that we need to sort through and one of the changes that's included in this bylaw is within the definition of long-term rental, we actually put a cap of the number of occupants in there. And I know it seems like a lot, but it's not in the context of how many we could ultimately have. We've capped it at 12 individuals, so a maximum of 2 per bedroom. You can think of these big 6-bedroom homes, that would be a maximum. And if you're renting out all of those, you'd have to have 2 parking spaces for the house itself, and then for each additional bedroom that you're renting, you would have to have 0.5 parking spaces per each additional bedroom. So you can think of it for every 2 bedrooms, you need an extra parking space. So we are trying to capture that, but we are in the midst of quite a tight rental market in Revelstoke, but we do have some stats, and there is so much going on in this community, and it will be alleviated, we're anticipating, over the next 2 to 5 years as some of these big projects come online. Just in a nutshell, we have 615 dwelling units that are at various stages of the approval process. Right now, some of them are under construction, close to occupancy. Some of them have development permits issued. That is all purpose-built rental, or what we call non-market housing. So we have so many housing units that are under construction that will alleviate this backlog. You can see the resort, they have 184 dwelling units under construction. BC Housing is going to be coming in on Downey Street, building another 165 purpose-built rentals that we're hoping to break ground on next year. So the issue will hopefully be resolved where we don't have single-family homes that are jam-packed so tight with renters when we build more purpose-built rental for this community.
Well, that's great news that we're getting that kind of long-term rental. I guess what I'm wondering is the zoning regulations. You talk about the parking for those established long-term rental places, and what impact does that parking have on the green space that is available on any of those properties?
You are bringing up the challenges at the granular level of detail that we deal with day in, day out, right? And this is where, as a community, you can see how quickly various items are brought to the surface. We want parking. We don't want anyone on the road. It's already an issue. But then we want to maintain green space, and we also want to be this climate-friendly community that people don't just drive to get here. How do you balance all that? And the answer is an imperfect answer. It's compromise with all of it, right? So we have to really pick and choose as a community. And in my opinion, the bylaw does quite a good job at taking a middle path on a lot of these issues, but they would still have to abide by the lot coverage and permeable surface coverage if they want to build additional parking areas on their property to accommodate it. But this is a really important piece that we have to reconcile as a community. What are our priorities? We can't do everything. We have to pick what ones are most important to us. And one thing as planners that we always encourage the community to think about is what type of community do we want to build, rather than just building for what we think our current problems are. And then in the future, we might be building a bunch of infrastructure and spending a bunch of taxpayer money and a bunch of landowner money on things that won't be as needed as they are today. Does that make sense?
Really great answers. I have one last one. And I'm just curious about if you have a fourplex or if you have a intensely used long-term rental and they're not near to the the sewer system, what are your expectations about how they handle that? Are there approaches that are going to work?
So just to clarify, if they're on a septic and you're concerned about the septic being overwhelmed?
Well, for new or long-term rental, yeah, exactly.
So if it's new development, we have that process at building permit, that check and balance where we make sure interior health sign-off, professional sign-off is provided as part of the application and issuing the permit. But for existing systems, it would be a complaint process, and Kenny can correct me if I'm wrong, through interior health, if there's any concern that the septic system is not functioning the way it should, because they'd be the enforcing agency.
So they would be enforcing it.
Yeah, the city can't, the way government's structured, we can't just, I know some people think like, oh, local government, you can do whatever you want. We are within this legal and legislative box. And again, too, you can't be everywhere all the time, and you can only enforce things that are within the realm of your local bylaws. So,
Thank you.
And that wouldn't be something that falls within our bylaws, it's interior health.
Great, thank you.
Of course. Come on up. Or if you yell it from there, I can repeat it into the mic, that's fine. Very good question, and I know exactly what you're getting at. So the question was, if we get really effective public transit and the frequency of transit stops for the buses increases, does that impact density? So the province, when they passed Bill 44, that legislation that required us to allow 4 units per lot, what they also said is anywhere within 400 meters of a bus stop that meets the definition of frequent transit service, which means a bus visits it every 15 minutes at least, you have to allow 6 units per lot, and you're not allowed to impose any minimum parking requirements on it. So before anyone jumps off the deep end in terms of the no parking requirements, because again, we're not there, we have worked with BC Transit, we have verified we don't currently have any transit stops that meet that definition. There might be some where they meet it for a portion of the year, but not consistently throughout the year. And when we've asked the province, well, that's something that could change into the future, what does that look like? Their response was, Well, if you guys eventually meet that definition, then our expectation is that you're going to be amending your zoning bylaws to comply with the legislation, but that there's not this policing agency for planners throughout the community. That's on us as professionals to make sure we do. So you guys can kind of see a bit of a common thread here in terms of some of the legislation that's coming top down, some of a push in terms of best practices that are happening in other communities. Parking is a really big challenge for new development, and any developer will tell you, if you have excessive parking requirements, it will impact the affordability of the housing project, full stop. So the province is trying to get ahead of that, but we're not quite there in Revelstoke, but it is something that could come up into the near future. So what intervals we're at, I just heard Mr. Black over there say 30 minutes roughly. So we could be a victim of our own success in some ways, but something to keep in mind as we go forward.
Hello. Are you allowed to build 2 single-family dwellings on one property? If so, what's the purpose of the 40% usable floor space equation for carriage suites? Does that make sense?
Sure. So yes, you could build 2 single families on the same lot. As long as you're compliant to all of your impervious surface, your maximum lot coverage, and you're meeting all your parking requirements, everything like that, as long as you can fit all that on there, you could do 2 single family dwellings. Some of the contractors in the room will tell you that it's a difference in your cost of your home warranty requirements when you're going between a carriage house versus a single family dwelling. Obviously different liabilities associated with the 2 of them, but you could in theory do a small single family and a large single family on the same lot, where traditionally you could consider it to be that it was a carriage house, but this allows it to essentially, you could and then say do it as a strata, and it could be a little bit more flexibility that way. Yeah, it was, does that kind of answer it, or is there a little bit more?
Sort of. I just, like, I'm confused as to why, like, what the difference would be between a carriage house or a garden suite and just another single-family dwelling on the same property.
With the changes that the province has introduced, there is essentially no difference, but it's really up to the owner, and this is where it would give you guys flexibility. Do you want to come in and build a carriage suite with a single family home? If so, you got to abide by that 40% rule. It will impact things like parking requirements. It will impact things like DCC payments that you have to make, setback requirements, all of these items. But essentially, if someone came in and said, well, I'm going to build a single family in a carriage suite, and we say, oh, you're over the 120 square meters or you're over the 40% rule. Okay, well, it's just 2 single family builds now. We'd say, okay, now you need to abide by all the development regulations associated with the single family house.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
We've grappled with this. We've had so many discussions internally about the different configurations and how it influences things like parking and DCCs and setbacks and all these things. And where we've kind of landed is, why would we not give landowners flexibility in what makes the most sense? One thing in Revelstoke, we have lots that were created in the 1800s. We have houses that are from the early 1900s. There are so many situations out there, and the amount of times landowners have had to go through this overly bureaucratic process to comply with the bylaws, it makes your head spin a little bit. And people ask, why are you putting me through the ringer on this? And it's like, we're just following the bylaw. So we're trying to get some flexibility in there for local landowners so that you can figure out what makes the best sense for your lot based on that existing development context.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep. Good question. So the question was, would that be under one title or would it be under separate titles? So what we call residential tenure, stratifying a property to create separate titles, doing a subdivision. Residential tenure itself, when it comes to stratifying, is not something that is necessarily in the control of local government. So you would be able to separate the titles via stratification if you wanted. But if you wanted to separate them via what we call fee simple, so a traditional subdivision with lot lines that are established, that would be an application that you would have to make to the city. And then we're going to be looking at, do you comply with minimum lot size? Do you comply with minimum lot width? Do you have separate services to each lot? Do you have separate access to each lot? So there's a lot of considerations that go into a typical fee simple subdivision compared to a strata subdivision that the city might not need to sign off on. There's some more nuanced details of it for signing off on strata subdivisions that I don't think anyone wants to be bored with right now. But if so, just say the word. We love this. This is what we do all day. No, okay, I'll take that as a no.
So, just continuing on the strata conversation, so, as somebody earlier mentioned, there's a lot of single-family homes, and now, under this new bylaw, they'll have capacity for 3, 4, maybe more units. At the moment, as I understand, if it's a blank lot, you could build, your 4 units and probably sell them off separately.
Sorry, sir, can you just come to the mic?
Oh,
So the people
sorry.
online can hear, no problem.
But if you had, a perfectly good home on a lot and you had capacity for 3 or 4 more units, is the only option for that homeowner to, basically build, finance, own and operate that whole property, that whole building without either selling part of it off to, other potential owners to reduce their financing burden, because I'm just imagining not a lot of homeowners have, can afford to spend, like you said, $500 a square foot to build another 3,000 square feet or something like that.
Yeah, so just for those listening online, the question was basically, if I'm gathering it correctly, is there some flexibility for local landowners who may be looking to subdivide or create separate title as a way to help finance some of these projects where it is very costly if you do want to meet the 4 units per lot? Yeah, very good question. One of the big challenges is if you want to come in to subdivide and you're creating separate lots, each of those lots is now entitled to the new density regulations. So where you might have been able to say you got a 1,000 square meter lot, you chop it down the middle, you got 2 500 square meter lots, now you can do 4 units on both those lots. So we have to consider that through the subdivision process. So it might be actually creating a bit more of a logistical or technical challenge that could prove to be more costly. If you wanted to stratify it, that's something that the city wouldn't have to generally sign off on. So you would just be working with your surveyor, you'd prepare a strata plan, you would have to set up a strata corporation.
Sorry to clarify though, if that was taking an existing home and just renovating or expanding it, you could do a strata plan without city approval, or?
The only time you need city approval to stratify is if it's an existing building that is previously occupied. So just think of it in the most simple context, an apartment building where it's under one title, someone wants to stratify that. Well, that's going to have an impact on the renters. So city council actually needs to sign off on that strata plan. If you have an existing home, and let's say you want to build an addition, you're calling it a duplex, and you want to stratify it so that it's on separate titles, that's typically something that wouldn't require city sign off because your new portion, your new dwelling unit isn't previously occupied.
Okay, so the expansion could be stratified.
Yeah. But I mean, again, all this stuff, you are looking at costs, $20,000, $30,000 to set up a strata, right? So it's not cheap.
Sure, okay. And sorry, the next question is just on the OCP, I know it was mentioned, and just clarifying, so is this new zoning bylaw, or, is the city feeling now that the OCP and the bylaw will be sort of in sync? I think other than you mentioned maybe the downtown area and short-term rentals possibly, or?
From a land use perspective, they'll be much more in sync than they are right now. Like as an example, in the OCP, and again, keep in mind land use, it's that high level vision that the communities help craft. And whenever someone comes in and says, I want to rezone my property, first thing the city looks at is that land use strategy. What's the land set up to be used for in the OCP? That guides the rezoning. The OCP, as an example, it sets this big environmental buffer around the city, but the zoning that we have in those areas right now allows for aggregate extraction, very, very heavy industrial activities that are contrary to the OCP land use. So this new environmental and rural recreation zone would help protect some of those environmental areas. That's one area that we're getting more consistent with the OCP. So as a whole, certainly more consistent, but it doesn't mean that we're done. It's always a work in progress, and as the needs of the community change, we'd be looking at doing OCP amendments and future zoning bylaw amendments with the community for specific areas of the town as needed to.
Okay, so for applications, if the OCP was, considered thoroughly and that's being used as a basis for thinking about, doing something, then that would be a good starting point. Is that?
It's a very good starting point, and some of the challenges that we see when zoning and OCPs don't typically align, and I'll give you some examples here. We have properties in the city that are zone medium density that aren't really medium density. They can't accommodate a lot of development on the lot. So when someone comes in and says, oh, under the OCP, my property is identified as medium density residential, I want to rezone to your medium density zone. That medium density zone doesn't align with the OCP. This zoning bylaw will fix that. You have a medium density land use designation in the OCP, you want to rezone, let's say you're zoned low density right now, you're going to have a suite of medium density zones to choose from that in theory could be supported in accordance with that OCP land use designation. So there's just better compatibility between the documents where they're speaking the same language is basically the simplest way we can put it. Does that make sense?
Okay, thank you.
So one of the questions online here is within the proposed RLD1 zoning, which is anyone right now who's zoned R1, R2, R2A, R1A, all these various low density zones, you're all for the most part getting wrapped up into what we call the RLD1, residential ground oriented zone. In the RLD1 zoning is a manufactured mobile home not on a permanent foundation allowed as a secondary dwelling unit? No, it would not be allowed. So one of the things we've done with this bylaw is really update and provide clarity in the definitions. Manufactured homes, so mobile homes, mobile home parks, manufactured home parks, whatever you want to call them, we're calling them manufactured homes in this bylaw because that's how the province refers to them. Manufactured homes are only permitted in a zone, and we have 2 zones that allow for it. They have to be in a zone that allows for the use manufactured home. Now, one thing we have done with this bylaw to clarify, though, is modular homes. So to get a little bit technical, so bear with me, I get it, it's super boring. Kenny loves this stuff. He dreams about this stuff at night as a building inspector. The CSA A277 model is a modular home that, it's kind of a more common form of building. It's more environmentally friendly because you don't produce as much waste, and it's a way for you to build off-site and then ship it on-site, but it functions as a permanent home that can't really be moved, at least not easily. We will allow modular homes anywhere in the city. So anyone that is looking at building a little bit cheaper for a secondary suite, whatever the case is, we've clarified, we'll allow that everywhere in the city where a residential dwelling unit is permitted. A manufactured home that's going to meet the Z240 model, that one is a specific mobile home that's only permitted in mobile home park zoning. So again, trying to get some flexibility in there, but we have to be very careful with mobile homes specifically because they're afforded different protections under the Manufactured Home Tenancy Act by the province than a typical home in the city. So does that make sense? Because I know it's a lot to unpack and we're referencing provincial legislation and all these other pieces and how they fit together. And there's a very cute kid that is distracting in here as well. I'm totally with you there. I get it. And it's way more exciting than boring technical zoning jargon. I can get that all day long. But yeah, so you can see like a common theme here. We're trying to give more flexibility and we're trying to give more clarity on what you can expect with different zones throughout the city. Right now, you're in a property and next to you is a medium density lot. If it's zoned medium density, you don't know if right now if they're gonna build a single family home, a duplex, a couple row houses, or if they're gonna try and build a big apartment building. This zoning bylaw update will give you better clarity as to what you can expect. And yes, it will accommodate more density. Like it or not, that's the only way to deal with this housing crisis. We have to implement every single tool in the toolbox. So it's one of the big changes that you're gonna see here. Throw it out to the crowd. Anyone want to brave the mic? Thank you.
I have a question. I missed out all the other public hearings, but regardless, could you clarify a little bit more about light industry zoning, please?
Interesting. Yes. So we have updated all 3 industrial zones. So we call them now industrial, low impact, medium impact, high impact. And you can think of it, they kind of build off of each other. And the simplest way we can put it is when you think of a low impact industrial zone, those are those zones where activities are predominantly carried on indoors. You're gonna have severe restrictions on outside storage, exactly what you would expect, kind of warehousing, a little bit of manufacturing and packaging, but nothing that's too invasive. And the whole idea is to try and, as best as we can, contain the impacts of that industrial activity to the building itself. When you go into the medium impact zone, the whole idea is centered around trying to contain the impacts to the boundaries of the property itself. When you get into the high impact zones, that's when you're talking heavy manufacturing, recycling plants, as well as aggregate extraction. That's when you're gonna have impacts that will expand beyond the boundaries of the property. And we wish we had all this stuff in place 30 years ago, but the whole idea is it gives you a better expectation of what that zone can accommodate. It's not gonna be perfect all the time. There's gonna be uses that in an M1 or an I1 zone now, it will go beyond the building itself, but that's the general intent, and the uses that are permitted in those zones and the conditions of use within those zones are set up to try and meet that goal.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. Now, expanding on that, have you zoned any more areas in Revelstoke for industry, whether it's 1, 2, or 3?
So at this time, and again, following the official community plan, the land use strategy, and we did, as part of that OCP, we did an employment analysis and from a land use perspective. And what it shows, we have a lot of underutilized land, especially within the Big Eddy and Powerhouse Road. So there's still a lot of potential there to build, and it didn't show that we necessarily needed more right now. But critically, I know. But from an underutilization perspective, whether or not property owners want to develop their land, that's a whole separate issue. But from a pure land use perspective, when you look at the numbers are saying, yeah, generally speaking, you have enough land. Whether or not it's being built upon is a whole other question, right? And then that's kind of a community economic development thing for how do we attract people to build on their lands that are zoned industrial. One thing that we have done with this bylaw, because commercial development is critically important, industrial development is critically important from a taxation perspective to have a sustainable tax base in the city. And we know that we're hurting for businesses and locations for businesses in the community. So we've expanded allowances for home-based businesses within residential areas with some important conditions of use to, again, maintain and mitigate any impacts. And one thing that we think is really interesting within our medium and high density zones, we actually allow, and not very much of it, but we're allowing for some small scale commercial within it. So it's not a mixed use zone, but it's a zone that, just picture an apartment building where maybe there's some office space in there, maybe there's a professional service establishment, a little massage parlor, or maybe there's a dentist office in there. So we're trying to get creative with how we can accommodate it in different areas. And we've also updated our mixed use zones, excluding the downtown and downtown fringe area, to make sure that the uses that are permitted in there are in line with where we're going in terms of a business trend perspective.
Okay, so for example, let's be a little bit more specific. Powerhouse Road units, what are they zoned at, please?
Oh, this development. Nope, it's an awesome one. We love it. We've been doing some work on this one lately. So some of the historic comprehensive development zones have posed challenges as of late due to lack of clarity within those zones about what uses are permitted and what the conditions of use within those zones are. So part of this project, and I am super proud of the whole team for this, because wherever you come from, these site-specific zones, which is what a comprehensive development zone is, it's site-specific. It's basically you craft your own zone for a particular parcel to accommodate a unique form of development. The city never got around to updating its zoning bylaw since '84, and so we relied so heavy on these site-specific comprehensive development zones, and it's posed challenges for us. So we cleaned these up as best we possibly could. We got rid of 10 out of 22 of them as part of this rewrite. They were old, they were antiquated, they weren't needed anymore. We had new standard zones that fit it. So the powerhouse zoning that you're referring to is currently CD zone 17. You're gonna be CD zone 07. Part of this project include going over every single use in the zoning bylaw. So remember, going back to Shannon's portion of the presentation, There's different zones scattered throughout the city. They tell you what you can do and what your development regulations are. What you can do is what we call permitted uses. We had about 200 permitted uses in the zoning bylaw. We had 5 different ways to describe a liquor store. And again, I enjoy drinks, I enjoy going out, but we don't need 5 different ways to describe a liquor store. We can just call it a liquor store. So part of what we did is we did what we call a use reconciliation. We cleaned up all the uses, and we're down to about 99 uses now, which showed you how many useless ones we had in the bylaw. So there's so much more clarity in there about what uses are permitted within your CD zone, how those uses are defined to give you more information on what that actually entails, and then critically important, the conditions of use, the development regulations that those uses now need to abide by. So there has been a massive cleanup that will improve clarity drastically within that zone, as well as all other industrial zones.
Where do I find this information?
Talk Revelstoke, we have a lot of information on there, and the draft bylaw itself is on there. And if you're not sure of what your zoning is under the new draft bylaw, we have a really nifty mapping tool on there. Just punch in your address. It'll tell you what your current zoning is with a link to the current zoning bylaw, and it will tell you what your proposed zoning is with a link to the most recent version of the draft zoning bylaw. And if you have any questions as you're going through it, just reach out to our development services group. You can email zoningbylaw@revelstoke.ca, and we're happy to speak with you. But this is why we're here tonight, is because we're at kind of the tail end of this process, and we wanted to give one more opportunity for people to become very well informed in advance of the public hearing. We're anticipating that if things go smoothly at council, probably sometime in February, start reading up, asking questions. You'll see there's so much information on Talk Revelstoke. And I know it's technical, I know it's kind of boring, so read it before bed. It'll put you to bed real nice. And become as familiar as you can. This is one of the hardest things to get people engaged with. Zoning is really, really tough because it's the granular level details. So please do take the time. We want to hear from you at the public hearing.
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
In case you need to find that Talk Revelstoke page, we did post a few of those QR codes. It's not the giant ones we have around here, but you will see there are a few QR codes kind of posted throughout the space that will take you to that Talk Revelstoke zoning bylaw page.
Uh-oh.
Buckle up, Paul. Question about the overall plan, because you guys have spent a considerable amount of time. We all want to put as much input in as possible. But when the province unilaterally basically slashed all of the planning that municipalities have done and changed the density from single family to 4, what do you see coming down potentially of the province changing and causing us to shift gears again in the future? Is that something potential, or is this the major change of the decade, century, etc.?
This would be the most substantial change we've had in probably 4 decades in this province. So the province really crafted these regulations for the Lower Mainland. No, to be serious, this is the result of communities being very opposed to gentle densification. And the way that municipalities are developing right now with expanding out, building only single-family housing is not sustainable. I am hypocrite number 1. I live in a single-family home. I will admit that all day long, and I love it. It is not sustainable in the long term. We need diversified housing. So I completely appreciate the intent that the province is trying to achieve. And it's a worthy intent but the hammer to apply it province-wide definitely poses some logistical challenges, especially for a community like Revelstoke, where we are unique in so many ways. So we don't anticipate many changes. There was 4 major pieces of legislation passed in 2023 and into 2024, and we're still playing catch up to implement some of the legislation, and not to mention the province is playing catch up. There's a new bill that they passed that allow us to do what's called inclusionary zoning. So any new apartment building that comes up, we can say, okay, 5% of units need to be affordable, or the developer pays cash in lieu into our affordable housing reserve that supports entities like our local nonprofit housing societies, which is awesome. We've been waiting for about 8 months on the specific guidebook that will give us details on how we can go about implementing that. We wanted to do that as part of this project. It's going to have to be its own separate project now. So I cannot see the province coming out with a lot more major pieces of legislation beyond what they've done over the last year now.
Makes sense.
We
And-
hope.
And because we're on the topic of parking, we're trying to figure out where I put my half vehicle to have the half parking stall. My kids need to go to bed.
You just either cut it horizontally or vertically down the parking space. We don't care which one. Now, I know it's super strange to see half a vehicle parking space, but you got to think about, so what we do is we obviously round in the bylaw when needed. So if someone's building 3 units and those units require 1.5 spaces per unit and it's 4.5, they need to provide 5 parking spaces. So you got to think of an apartment building as a good example. Building 30 units, 1.5 spaces per unit. If they end up with a half a space, they either got to round up, but if it ends up as an even space, then it works out well for them. So it all comes down to the rounding. So we got a few more questions online. I'm just doing a quick time check, 7:30. We are here until 8 o'clock, and I give everyone who has sat through this much of the meeting so far so much credit. This takes a lot of willpower and a lot of attention span, so everyone should be really proud of themselves, because zoning is, again, quite a dry topic. So really, really happy that people have stuck it out. And oh, exactly, on a Wednesday night too, and especially while the Leafs are playing. I mean, am I the only Leafs fan in here? So, next question. Is the usable floor space of a basement suite included in the equation of a garden or carriage suite? So this is a question online. The usable floor space of a basement suite, is that included in the calculation of a garden suite or carriage suite? I'm trying to fully understand and unpack this one a bit more, because the way that the zoning rules work is you have your single family dwelling. I want to build a secondary suite. That secondary suite cannot comprise more than 40% of the overall building area of your suite plus your home. And the intent of that is to make sure that that suite remains secondary. If it's 50-50, then it's essentially a duplex. So it doesn't really make sense to call it a secondary suite. So I think that there's a bit of confusion there, but if I'm confusing the question, I encourage that individual to reach out to us and we'll have a good chat and get things clarified. If that is the question, so just for those online, maybe the question is referring to whether or not the basement of a secondary suite is captured within the allotment. We don't usually get basements within a secondary suite because they're sometimes in the basement. Let's say a carriage suite has a basement. Is that included in your floor area calculation? Totally depends how you're using it. If it's a storage space, no, we wouldn't include it. But if it's an occupiable space that has living rooms and bedrooms, bathrooms, etc., then it would most certainly be included. And this is where in the bylaw, when it comes to dwelling units and when we're restricting things based on size, we're restricting it based on what we call usable floor space as opposed to gross floor area. So we got some really good feedback where if we go based on gross floor area, you're penalizing people because you measure it from the outside of the walls. It includes every nook and cranny in the house, crawl spaces, storage areas, etc. And then it's less buildable space for people. So when we go to a usable floor space definition, when we do have restrictions on sizes, you measure it from the inside of the walls. You don't get penalized for building in an energy efficient way. We don't include areas like storage because that's not really space that you're using on a 24/7 basis. So again, trying to promote a little bit more flexibility within the bylaw. Next question, could you have 4 monster homes on one 1,000 square meter lot if the basement foundations were connected below grade, thus only making 2 buildings, but visually above grade it looks like 4 separate monster homes? We came up with so many examples of this 4 units per lot, and this didn't come up. We did not consider the underground bunkers that could connect buildings. So we would consider that to be 4 separate detached buildings. And this is a hill that we will die on, so if we do have some landowner or developer that comes in and says, I don't care, I'm going to build 4 big lots, we're not going to issue them permits. So we are trying to maintain the integrity of these different neighborhoods within the community as we are adapting to change that is needed and in some cases can be a little messy, especially in a community that's booming like Revelstoke. But we would not be or allowing that to go forward. Definitely not. If the plan is for downtown homeowners to park in their rear yards, will the rear lanes be plowed by the city? So the city does, we have again, say he's 125 years old. We have laneways that were drafted up on plan of subdivisions back in the late 1800s. I do not envy Mr. Black and his team having to deal with the snow removal in this town, especially as we are seeing more and more development, but they do an amazing job. Laneways are plowed when they are constructed up to a certain standard. You know, we have some that are basically unconstructed laneways that are really challenging, obviously, to get a plow back there. It's just a matter of priority. And so if anyone has any questions about the operations, definitely encourage them to reach out to Public Works. Not something that we'll be dealing with as part of this particular zoning bylaw update, but do rest assured that we continually have these conversations when we see new development applications come in. Every single new development permit we get, every big application gets referred to our engineering group, Public Works group. So believe it or not, we do speak with each other and we do take into consideration the feedback that other departments have. And if operationally this stuff doesn't work, then we work with applicants to change their plans. And I know the community only sees the back end of the process when something's before council, maybe it's elicited some concern, but they don't see, I don't like this phrase, but how the sausage is made to get there. There is so much back and forth with applicants based on a variety of perspectives, policies, bylaws, regulations that are imposed on them before they get to that final form. It's not like an application comes in and we just say, okay, rubber stamp, go ahead. There's a lot of work with staff before it even comes close to getting to the council stage. Next one, explain the maximum usable floor space equation for carriage suites. 40% of the total usable floor space of the principal dwelling plus total usable floor space of carriage or garden suite combined. Unsure how to use the solution in the equation. So you got a house, now you want to build a carriage suite. You need to tell us what the total usable floor space of the house is and what the total usable floor space of the carriage suite is. That carriage suite, when you add those two numbers together, cannot be over 120 square meters, and it cannot be more than 40% of the combined usable floor space of the house and the carriage suite. And again, it's an effort to try and keep it secondary. It's not intended to overpower the principal residence. It's intended to be secondary to it. So before we go to some online questions again, anyone else in here want to come up to the mic? Oh, sorry.
I don't need a mic, thank you. Apologies, I'm a Bitter Hats fan. Just apologies. Can you answer and clarify, Paul, because I received phone calls at City Hall from some folks saying, I just read the draft zoning bylaw, and you, city staff, the city, you, the planner, you have downzoned my property, and you didn't talk to me, and I'm upset. Now, you and I know that there's two avenues still. We haven't adopted the bylaw, and we're asking for feedback. And secondly, you can always go for a rezone subject to OCP compliance. Can you explain to the folks online and here tonight that even though we have presented a draft zoning bylaw with proposed zones, that the folks still have a say? And you've touched on it tonight several times, but I have responded to those folks who have asked that the city has downzoned my property without my consent. There's still some confusion out there about how this process actually works. So if you could just one more time, just clarify that, thank you.
I think you answered it very well there. I'll take that answer. Yeah, so the question was downzoning. So we've tried really hard as part of this bylaw. We want to promote increased flexibility to achieve the overall goals as spelled out in the OCP, which has had over 1,300 hours of volunteer time dedicated from community champions. So we are following this roadmap in the OCP. Now that said, there are properties in the city where one would perceive it to be a down zone. I used to be able to do all these uses in my zone. Now you've severely restricted that. That has happened. So one of the main reasons why we've done that is, again, to get this zoning bylaw and the on-the-ground rules for what you can and cannot do on your property more in line with this broader land use strategy that the community has had so much input on as part of our zoning bylaw rewrite. And a really good example of this is, I think everyone in here has probably been out to the Jordan River area. That area, technically under our zoning right now, is permitted some pretty heavy industrial uses. The OCP says protect this area. It's environmentally sensitive. We don't want to see anything happen in there. So now we're getting the zoning to be more in alignment. But if someone owns land in that area, they might say, well, now you're down zoning me. What this would trigger is someone having to do an official community plan amendment along with a rezoning application. We're not saying no. We are saying if you want to develop in some of these areas, we need to think a little bit more carefully. The zoning that was applied to you back in 1984 isn't working for the community anymore, and you shouldn't just be able to go ahead without any checks and balances from a community perspective. And that OCP amendment process is quite extensive from a community consultation perspective, because you're changing the direction that we're going. Now, for the particulars of this zoning bylaw project, we're not done. The public hearing is so critical, and I don't want anyone to disregard the impact and the power of a public hearing. This is a big project. You will see staff proposing to council that we take it slow as we go through the approval process or the consideration of approval process. And people need to show up. They need to come to the public hearing. They need to tell council specifics on changes that should be considered. And if council says to staff, hey, you know what? We think that the zoning of this property should actually be changed for these reasons, then staff are here to say, okay, that would mean we had to change the OCP to this, and we got to change the zone to this. Let's get to it. So there is this opportunity. Now, that said, we don't want everyone coming out and saying, I'm in the middle of Arrow Heights in a low-density area and give me the high-density zone so that I can sell my property for a whole bunch of money and someone can put a 6-story apartment on there. Staff will be pretty adamantly opposed to that, but we really want people to consider not just what is in their own individual interest, but what's in the broader community interest. And if it's something that makes sense, then it's definitely an item for council to consider as we go through the public hearing process. So please do show up. It does make a very big difference. Thank you for that question. So, next question online. Why only 4 on one lot? If it is so expensive to build, how is this supposed to help with affordability of housing? Why not 10 units per residential lot? Price per door would be lower. I can't argue with that. I think that Mr. Black from our engineering team would have some serious questions about how we're going to service it and how we're going to make sure that we have adequate access and what this ultimately looks like and the impact on character in the community. 4 units per lot is where the province landed, so that's the minimum we have to do. If the community feels we should be going above and beyond that and allowing more, the recommendation from the planning group would be to start low and go slow. We need to these documents are living documents. They're not intended to sit on a shelf for 40 years like our current zoning bylaw did and then become so antiquated and outdated that the only way you can build in this town is by doing a site-specific zone or getting a bunch of variances. They're intended to be reviewed, methodically updated every 3 to 5 years based on the needs and the changing dynamics of the community. So who knows where we go in the future, but for the time being, the 4 units per lot is quite a drastic change. It has posed a lot of challenges and complications for many communities, and Revelstoke is no different. And we don't even know how this is fully going to work out. So I think we need to be very strategic about where we allow increased density, and there needs to be a better understanding in the community about the specific properties that are already zoned and could potentially, this is critical, potentially be rezoned based on that OCP land use map into the future. So if you don't take anything else away from today, it's take a look at map 10 in the OCP. That is a critical map for everyone to become familiar with. The next question is the floor space of a garage. I'm awful at reading sometimes. Is the floor space in the garage in the carriage suite, and it's getting late, used in the total usable floor space? The floor space in the garage would generally not be included. Can I build a car lift in the front yard for 8 car spaces? You would need to comply with all the provisions we have in the zoning bylaw for setbacks, impervious lot coverage, general building lot coverage, all these good things you'd have to comply with.
And building code, which, let's be real, that's not going to be a cheap build. It's not going to be something that's going to be very viable to do, but I mean, good creativity, I like it.
Yeah, one thing with this bylaw though, we are proposing additional allowances for carports. So take a look. It's an amenity in Revelstoke, we need covered parking. It's really challenging in this community, especially as we're thinking about seniors in this community and aging in place. Having a covered parking space can make all the difference about livability on your own property. So we're trying to incorporate some flexibility for that while still being mindful of our operations team and how far away we need to be from the property line so that they can have effective snow clearing operations. Where can I find details to the new environmental and rural recreation zone? How did you decide to designate this zone on specific lots? So the details, we'd encourage you to look at the draft zoning bylaw, and it is specifically section 9 of the draft zoning bylaw. You'll see the provisions in section 9.1 for the environmental and rural recreation zone, and we are following the land use strategy that was outlined in the official community plan. We look at items such as canopy coverage, so tree coverage, we look at riparian areas, and as part of the OCP, both the 09 OCP and the current OCP, there was a lot of environmental mapping that was done, so we also did follow that environmental mapping. But super cool project we're hoping to do in a couple of years is update our environmental mapping. So we want to get more on the ground specifics. So definitely keep your ear to the ground, as there probably will be some changes going into the future. Your comment on build it and they will come. How does this not apply to high density housing? We can't build our way out of the housing shortage in a community like Revelstoke. We are looked at as an investment opportunity, unaffordable. We get this comment all the time. Two things we can't control as local government. We live in a capitalist system where money is free to move around in Canada, and people are free to move around in Canada. We can do our best to try and set up the approval framework and the zoning structure to incentivize the type of development that we want. But when people are coming in here, there will be homes that are constructed that are unaffordable to the average person. But I will say, and we got some numbers here, since 2021, we have 224 units that are at various stages of the approval process. Most of them, or a lot of them, are getting ready for occupancy. Most of them are under construction or at the development permit stage. These are all market missing middle housing, apartments, row houses with secondary suites in them. And all of these are not permitted to be used as short-term rental. So we're trying really, really hard to restrict this new development as only an investment opportunity. I get that, but there's only so much that we can control, and we have to structure the approval framework, again, to incentivize the housing that we want. We know if we only allow single-family houses to get built in this community, like it or not, it's not going to be affordable. If we start seeing more row homes, more apartment buildings, various secondary suites in those units, you will see affordability on the market side. We need to do that while concurrently trying to construct as much non-market housing and purpose-built rental as we can to alleviate the housing crunch for the most vulnerable people in the community. And we, again, 615 units is what we're at right now for purpose-built rental as well as non-market housing. That is in the queue, in the hopper for construction, in addition to 288 units of non-market housing that's existing in the community. So you can think of it over the next 3 to 5 years. We estimate that non-market and purpose-built rental will constitute approximately 17% of our total housing stock, which is pretty good. Doesn't mean we're done, but it's a pretty good point to be at in this community, and hopefully we hit more of an equilibrium.
So real quick before I let Paul jump on to the next question, and I know it involves hockey, so he's really excited to talk about it. One of the other things to consider, and I'll pose this as a question to everybody. If we were to designate some of these properties as allowing the high density, that takes away that possibility for when going through that rezoning process. As the community, wouldn't you prefer to be able to provide your input on whether or not that specific property, and again, looking at it as that specific property driven by specifically like a developer, would it not be in the best interest of the community for you guys to be able to actually share your thoughts on that community, go to your council, say, hey, this isn't the right property for us, here's why we think so. That if we were to pre-zone properties to allow for that higher density, that wouldn't necessarily happen. Whereas going through that rezoning process, it does allow the community as a whole to start sharing their input. And it gives you guys a better idea, a better opportunity to kind of share. Do you feel that that's the right vision for that neighborhood, for that part of the community? So be it, right? Like that just allows all of you to be more involved. I'll let Paul go on to his favorite one now.
Now, I appreciate this next question in more ways than one. So the first one, I appreciate the comment from the individual here. if you guys can see it, it says, "Thank you so much for working with the beekeepers to make those changes." So we heard this community when we released the original draft of the zoning bylaw. They were not happy with the beekeeping regulations that were proposed, and we changed them. We worked with local subject matter experts to change them, and I just want to make clear, the planning process can be difficult to participate in. We get that. And we don't get everything right when we're doing this work at the onset, but when we're doing these big projects, when we're setting policy, the process is designed for the community to be able to participate at that level. The process is really bad at the community participating at the back end when you see something that's proposed on an individual lot that's already zoned, but it's really good when we're doing projects like the OCP and a big comprehensive rewrite of our zoning bylaw. At best, on the back end, it's designed to just inform you of the changes. This is where we literally sat down with members of the beekeeping community, workshopped some regulations, put them up on the board and said, what works here, what doesn't work? So that is an awesome thing about working in a small town. And I just want people to know that we do genuinely listen. And when there's items that come up that make sense to change and we got the local subject matter expertise, we want to hear it and we want to make the changes based on that. And that's what we did here. So I appreciate that. And I don't think Kadri should come back to the Leafs. Definitely not. He's dead to me. Next question, can you have a single family with a basement suite and a carriage or garden suite to have 3 units? Yes, you can. You just need to start getting very careful because under BC Building Code, a secondary suite with a single family home needs to be what we call a single real estate entity, so it's under its own separate title, and then you would have this carriage suite that would need to be dealt with in the back. So we'd probably call it a duplex and then a single family home at the rear. But this is where we're gonna, and I'm sure we're gonna have a bunch of these creative options that come up, but in general, yes, you would be permitted to do that. Would the city approve 6 units on a 1,000 square meter lot with a bus stop within 10 meters if all parking setbacks are met and density requirements? We need housing. Excellent question. It's all based on what your current zoning is and what your proposed zoning is, obviously, if this bylaw gets adopted. And if your proposed zoning doesn't accommodate that, then we would be looking at what does the OCP say? Does the OCP say you should be a medium density lot? If so, let's do that. If right now you're a low density lot in the OCP and you have low density zoning and you say, I want to build 6 units or 8 units, you would need to do an official community plan amendment along with a rezoning application. So it's all from a process perspective, very dependent on the site specifics of your lot. But I will say our OCP sets the stage to want to support more housing. It's needed to get out of this crisis that we're in. We need to increase the supply of housing as one of the tools in the toolbox. What are the parking requirements under the new RLD1 zone? It's based on lot size. So if you're under a certain lot size, and I'm gonna forget it, I think it's 350 square meters, which is current zoning regulations as well, you're only required to have 1 parking space per dwelling unit. But if you're over 350 square meters, then you're required to have 2 parking spaces per dwelling unit. 370, Mr. Gips just corrected me. But that's if you're building a single family home or a 2-unit or duplex home. If you wanted to put 4 row houses on there, you need 1.5 parking spaces because we would call that a multi-unit dwelling, where instead of 2 parking spaces per unit, you need to have 1.5 parking spaces per unit. Would 2 single family dwellings on the same lot or similar size be allowed on a property zone low density? Yes, it would. Before we go, I just want to do a quick time check here. We're at 7:51, and because we have so many brave individuals that are willing to sit here on an awesome Wednesday night, again, I'll remind you where the Leafs are playing. Does anyone in here have any questions before we answer a couple more from the online Slido app?
I have one more question that you won't appreciate. And this question is for the whole room. How many people walked here tonight? I'm just making a point about parking downtown and the need of it. I don't see any of the city staff. They maybe all.
Oh, sorry, I walked here.
Walked from City Hall or walked from your residence?
Walked from
here?
home.
Okay.
As I do every day.
As well as our director of engineering.
So, yeah, you drove, yeah. So I'm just making a point, thank you.
Did anyone have trouble finding parking? I'm sorry, I
Come
had
to
to.
my
I'm sorry,
downtown area.
I'm sorry, I had to.
Yeah.
I-
So I walk and I ride my bike everywhere, but it's becoming a problem in my neighborhood in the Heritage District. And the
100%.
reduction of parking on all the commercial endeavors is creating problems in the residential area. That's what I'm trying.
You are totally correct there, and and in all seriousness, and again, this stuff is so technical and it's so dry and boring. Like, we do got to try and have a little bit of fun sometimes. So I do appreciate you being a really good sport. I really appreciate it. But we are very cognizant that parking is a challenge that is continually brought up within this community, especially in the downtown and the surrounding downtown areas. I really encourage everyone. Mr. Black, we're very lucky to have him here. He's very experienced. He could be anywhere else in the world, as many staff at City Hall could do. And he is going to be leading our parking management strategy, and we've already kind of kicked it off. Please do come and participate. It'll be such an interesting project. And the more you guys participate, you start seeing some of the challenges and the complexities of this stuff that we're dealing with. We're trying to solve a problem on housing. We're trying to diversify our tax base and see more commercial. Then we also have this parking challenge, and you start to see the trade-offs that we have to work through. And there's no one evil in City Hall saying we just want to ruin everything for the locals. It's quite the contrary, but none of this stuff is easy. If it was easy, it wouldn't be a problem. And the more people come out and the more they understand those complexities, there's a better appreciation, and we get to a better place at what trade-offs do we need to make that, you know, always encourage people, don't come in and think of any application or any process as a win-lose mentality. It's always about what can you live with? You know, there's going to be change. How do we manage that change? What are the concerns that people are experiencing within their local areas? You know, I don't live in the Heritage area. I live in Southside. So I don't know it as intimate as the community does there. And we've made so many changes to this bylaw, dozens of changes based on that intimate knowledge that the locals in this community have. But it only works so well if you guys come out to participate. And it's not easy, and it takes time, and everyone has a life, and we get that. The more you participate as part of these policy setting projects, the better the outcomes are. So that's, we really do encourage you, and I do appreciate you being a really good sport. I had to ask the question, but I don't want to minimize it, because it is an issue and it is a challenge, and we also got to start thinking, you know, we do have an aging community. There are people with mobility challenges. How do we manage that as we go into the future? We look at paid parking. Should the residents get a free little parking pass so that they don't have to pay for the parking, right? So all these cool things we can do, and it'll be an exciting project. So we're keen to kick it off. And I will give council a lot of credit, because they did expedite that project, because they have heard from the residents, where it was originally going to be done in 26, and they're like, no, we need to do this now. So we've bumped it up to 2025. So we're getting to it. Couple more questions here, but again, I just want to give the opportunity for anyone in the room, because we will look at all the questions on the Slido app, and we'll provide answers, and we'll post them on Talk Revelstoke, so we will get it done. We got 5 minutes left here, so we can get y'all out of here at 8 o'clock, and hopefully everyone takes all the snacks. But come on up, or yell it from there.
Just one question, really, in the sense of, like, I mean, the province has put forward, like, all these new regulations, right? Densification, all that going on. I mean, that's fantastic. You know, we have a housing crisis and stuff. But what support is there going to be from the province for communities like ourselves, right, to deal with all the extra infrastructure that's going to be necessary in order to deal with all this densification? Like, if we're going to increase housing units, we're going to put in higher density, we're going to do all this, we're going to have to upgrade our waste treatment facilities, our water lines, all of that part, right? So just what can the community expect kind of going forth, like, you know, as a city, support from the province, because they've basically put that legislation into, you know, broad effect through the whole province?
That is a tough question. We do receive grants. We do receive money as a resort municipality. We get 2 weeks worth of the MRDT tax, I believe is correct, for the whole year, to help offset some of the challenges. This is something that this council, prior councils, and staff, you know, our CAO, Mr. Parliament, is continually going and advocating and attending conferences and having meetings with provincial staff to inform them of the challenges that we have from an infrastructure perspective. Because we are designated as a resort town, it's extra unique in addition to accommodating all this density. And we've gotten quite good at doing what we do over the last few years. We have a very competent complement of city staff across various departments. So we are seeing things move, and we are seeing better infrastructure planning be done, better long-range financial planning be done to offset the costs. Mr. Black and his team are working on a development cost charge update to try and update our fees so that we do have enough money to pay for infrastructure. But it's a really good question, and to be quite honest, and I know the province deals with a lot, but we don't get enough funds. It's plain and simple. And so it becomes a area where we have to continually get creative, constantly apply for grants, both at the provincial and federal level, which becomes very politically volatile. There's a huge $6 billion fund out right now from the federal government that the Conservatives have said they're going to slash if they get in. That is all dedicated towards infrastructure funding. So the city is having to reconcile this. We've made 2 applications now to the Housing Accelerator Fund, which is a $4 billion fund from the federal government, where we're hoping to get over $4 million, where about $3 million would go towards infrastructure. It's desperately needed in the community, and yeah, it's hard to have a crystal ball to say what's going to come out in the future, but we do chase down every opportunity we get. And I would pass it off to Mr. Parliament, Mr. Black, if they have anything that I'm missing. Maybe they won't be so politically correct about it.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, the challenge for us is to pay for infrastructure, density is the answer. Single family is a net loss. And I'm a single family person, and I like single family neighborhoods, but it's a net loss to the municipality. For every house we issue a permit, it's actually a net loss when you think of the cost to service that lot, to support that lot, whether it's recreation, whether it's public works, etc. The answer is density, and high density is from a business model, is good for the city. High density provides more cash to pay for the infrastructure we need to advance the community. And so right now, we're looking at about $190 million in the next 10 to 20 years in upgrades from a new arena to a new bridge, to do this, do that. And how do you pay for $190 million when our model is based on an 1867 model where property taxes were to pay for core services back in the day, water, sewer, roads. That's why property taxes were introduced. Now local governments do everything, not just water, sewer, roads, but everything that the feds and the province have done over the years, most notably housing and addiction and homelessness. So how do you pay for that? That's always a challenge. So we want to protect the integrity of the community and keep Revelstoke unique and green, but from a financial business point of view, because our model doesn't work, property taxes are not a source of revenue to pay for everything, we have to densify so more people pay, take advantage of infill where the existing services lie, where the cost is a lot cheaper. That's a challenge. That's for another discussion. Maybe we'll have a separate open house. This venue seems to bring people out, so maybe that's a topic we can contemplate and meet again, folks. So with that, thank you, Paul, and your team. Well done. Well done.
So it's 8 o'clock on the dot. Unless there's any final burning questions, we'll get to answering. There's only 4 questions left on the Slido app, but we'll post answers to everything in writing, put it on Talk Revelstoke. We really appreciate everyone coming out today. Don't see any final burning questions, so on your way out, take some coffee, hot chocolate, stuff a bunch of snacks in your coat pockets, and enjoy the walk or drive home. Thank you.